Right, we're on the final part of Esio, Trot. You might remember that Mrs Silver she now realises that her tortoise has grown. Unfortunately, poor old tortoise can no longer get into his little house to keep himself warm at night. So Mr Silver has a plan. Now he's asking Mrs Silver to undo the magic words, change the magic words, so perhaps the tortoise is going to start getting smaller. So let's see what happens when they reverse the magic words. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr Hoppy. Mr Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, Esio Trot, teg atib ralams, atib ralams. That'll do it, Mrs Silver, he said, handing her the paper. I don't mind trying it, Mrs Silver said, but look here, I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr Hoppy. Oh, he won't, dear lady, he won't. Mr Hoppy said, say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and then see what happens. We might be lucky. If it works, Mrs Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, then you are the cleverest man alive. The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs Silver had gone to work, Mr Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller, so that it could just go through the door of the little house. He soon chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs Silver's homecoming. That evening, Mr Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs Silver's shouts from below, shrill with excitement. Mr Hoppy, where are you? She was shouting. Just look at this. Mr Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, What's up? Oh, Mr Hoppy, it's worked. She was crying. Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle. Can I come down and look? Mr Hoppy shouted back. Come down at once, my dear man, Mrs Silver answered. Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie. Mr Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the stairs, two at a time, with the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. This is it, he whispered to himself under his breath. The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep very calm. When he was 3/4 of the way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs Silver already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, You really are the most wonderful man. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve. Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs Silver's parlour, sipping his tea, Mr Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, Mrs Silver, please, will you marry me? Why, Mr Hoppy, she cried, I didn't think you'd ever get round to asking me. Of course I'll marry you. Mr Hoppy got rid of his teacup and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. It's all due to Alfie, Mrs Silver said, slightly breathless. Good old Alfie, Mr Hoppy said. We'll keep him forever. The next afternoon, Mr Hoppy took all of these other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. And a few weeks later, Mrs Silver became Mrs Hoppy, and the two of them lived very happily ever after. P.S. I expect you're wondering what happened to little Alfie, the first of them all. Well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Squibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dried leaves in the tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her, still the much-loved family pet, and Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow to twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver had him, but he made it in the end. Look, there's a picture of the little Alfie, not so little now, the double-sized Alfie, living with Roberta and her family. So that's Esio, Trot. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed telling you. Until next time, take care.